الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وآله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Today we're going to start with chapter number 3, the Fiqh Maxims, Al-Qawaid Al-Fiqhiyya. And he's going to mention over here 7 of these maxims specifically related to the medical field. Although there are many more which are applied, but these you could say are like the cornerstones within the fiqh maxims when it comes to the field of medicine. Now, fiqh maxims, in Arabic, qawaid al-fiqhiyya, it's made out of 2 words, al-qawaid, and the second is al-fiqhiyya. So, qawaid is the plural of qaida, which means the foundation of anything, right? It could be both a physical foundation or it could be an abstract meaning. So, for example, it's mentioned in the Quran, وَإِذْ يَرْفَعُ إِبْرَاهِيمُ الْقَوَاعِدَ مِنَ الْبَيْتِ وَإِسْمَاعِيلُ, and mention Ibrahim alayhi salam when he was raising the foundations of the house, of the Holy Kaaba, and Ismail was with him. And it could also mean like the foundation of an abstract concept. For example, Da'ainuddin, the foundation of the deen of Islam, for example. Most of us probably went through Al-Qaeda before starting the Quran, which was basically how to pronounce the words, uh, the letters, and then small words, right? Either you went through Qaeda Baghdadiya or the Nurani Qaeda, maybe. So that was also basically the foundations for the Quran, which we used to study. Now, but when you use the word Qaeda in a more terminological sense, uh, it refers to a general principle that applies to many specific situations and many individual situations, which can all be tied together using a general principle. And the fuqaha usually say that a qaida uh, is a universal verdict that applies to all or most specific cases, right? So, for example, when I use the words al-umur bi maqasidiha, that actions are judged by intentions, this includes every action that a person would take, right? Similarly, al-yaqeen la yazulu bil-shak, that certainty is not displaced by doubt. This is a qaida that is applied across uh, the literature in fiqh, whether it be salah, whether it be tahara, be it what we're studying, medical jurisprudence. It can also be used in Hajj, for example. So it's used across many subjects. Now, what are the benefits of studying these qawaid? Well, first of all, these maxim can help us to remember the rulings of specific issues, right? There are thousands, if not millions, of specifics and individual cases mentioned within the fiqh literature, and it's almost impossible for most people to actually memorize each and every one of them. And so the best way to actually understand or keep track of most of them is by learning them through these fiqh maxims. So if you know a maxim, you understand its application well enough, that allows you to basically, let's say, relieve yourself from learning thousands of individual masail. Second benefit that you can get is studying specific issues and rulings without realizing the connection between them can sometimes lead to misunderstanding of lack of clarity. So when you have so many masail scattered all over the place and nothing's tying them together, this can cause confusion. Especially sometimes some of the cases might seem contradictory in a way, but there is reason for the differences between them. right? But just studying individual cases might not help you develop that skill in realizing how the fiqh is actually functioning. Also, uh, these maxims help develop the aptitude of jurisprudence, especially like if you work in a dar ifta or you're closely related with the study of fiqh, right? This helps you understand how the fuqaha used to think and how they used to actually engage with the Quran and Hadith in order to derive the ahkam that they did. So basically, it paints a bigger picture of what's going on behind the scenes, right? And usually, most maxims are agreed upon between the fuqaha. And so, studying them can actually help in studying comparative fiqh as well. So, you'd understand that if a certain mas'ala is based on this maxim, and realizing that this is amongst the maxims which is agreed upon, you might be able to derive the conclusion that this masala is muttafaq alayh between madhahib. This is the same masala which will be used by someone following the Hanafi madhab as well as the Shafi, Hanbali, and Maliki madhab as well. Right? Another faida is also to show the comprehensiveness of fiqh and from there the comprehensiveness of Islam. Right? That's not just answers to problems without any underlying philosophy. Rather, every answer that the Quran has or the Hadith have is actually pinned down by something much greater. And an important faida that it's worth mentioning is if you've studied the maxims well enough, sometimes you have to make snap judgments. You won't have the time to consult a fiqh expert, right? And these maxims are very helpful when you have to make those really quick judgments. Because if you know them, 90% of the time, you would probably find the right answer. Sometimes the problem comes is that a single situation could possibly be based on two different contradictory maxims. And so you have to choose one over the other, right? But the chances of that happening are rare. And so if you apply the maxim in that quick decision that you have to make, so it's probably 89% of the time you would have made the right decision, right? So it can also be very helpful when you need to make quick judgments and you don't have time to consult someone. That said, a note must be made that it takes time to actually be an expert in practicing these qawaid. And even then, a lot of caution must take place before we actually try to make something of this. Because if we don't, uh, if our understanding is weak or if we don't give it enough time, we could end up with actually very wrong results from these applications. So it is best to be careful when using them. Now, the first qaida that the book mentions is az-zararu yuzal, i.e. that harm must be removed, right? So if there's any sort of harm that occurs, removing it and its effects is wajib, it's necessary, right? So any sort of effect, whether it's injury, loss or destruction of property, right? Even a waste of property, all of that will be included in it. So although az-zarar yuzal is a declarative statement, you should know that such statements uh, are actually ahkam, right? Or you could say that it's prescriptive, that if you find any sort of harm, then all means should be applied in order to remove it. Now, how is it applied in the field of medicine? Well, first of all, for example, uh, it tells us that seeking medical treatment is permissible, because diseases, they cause harm to the human health, the human body, right? And they could even you could even expand it to say that if a person's sick all the time, they can't function, which means they can't work, and hence they can't earn, which would result in the loss of property as well, right? And so that's why seeking medical treatment has been made permissible. So a person can eliminate the harm that is caused by the disease and alleviate any pain and complications. That through all means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made permissible, of course. Second, it is permissible to replace a limb that has been severed due to an accident, because obviously a loss of limb has lots of problems that come with it. The difficulties one can imagine. And so such surgeries or treatments that would allow a person to replace their severed limb is permissible. For number three, for the hermaphrodites, who have both sets of genitalia. So the modern scholars have almost a consensus on the fact that a hermaphrodite can have a surgery to remove that extra pair of genitalia and just keep the ones that are most closest to their sex, right? And I'm not going to talk about that whole concept of transgenderism. That's just psychological rubbish. And also, blood transfusion would be permissible when there is a need for it, because obviously it is needed there to remove harm. Uh, Transplanting parts of one's own body to other parts, such as in skin grafts, uh, moving bones or cartilage, could also be allowed in cases where there's actual harm which needs to be rectified. Now, there's one example that the book mentions, but that is quite debatable, and it's still very heatedly debated amongst different ulama. And that is that it suggests that if a person before their death have given permission that their organs be donated after they die, it would be permissible to transplant that dead person's organ to a living person, with the condition that the transplant of that organ is something on which that person's life is dependent on. For maybe a kidney and that person was on dialysis, right? So that's condition number one. And condition number two is permission. So either the dead person that they give consent for that, or the heirs of that person who has died, or if they didn't have any heirs, like if it's a John or a Jane Doe, then if the Waliyu Amrul Muslimin, anyone who's like the Muslim community leader, if they give permission, that would also be acceptable. That's condition number two. And condition number three is that there should be a chance of success. And you should know that there is an actual possibility of success. With these three conditions, some ulama allow for the transplant of organs from a dead person to a living person. Another example of this could be the use of prosthetics, right? So if it is permitted to use prosthetics to compensate for a loss of limb, provided that the procedure does result in the provided that it does not result in more harm being done, right? Because loss of limb is a harm, but if it's going to result in more harms, then it should be prevented. If not, then go ahead with it. قاعدة number two, الضرر يدفع بقدر الإمكان. That harm is repelled as much as possible. And this maxim basically indicates that it is best to take preventative measures, to take measures to repel harm before it actually ever occurs, right? So would be allowed to use all feasible means and resources to in order to prevent any harm from being done in the first place. But if it's not possible, right, you can't maybe remove the harm entirely, protect from it, then once the harm has occurred, all efforts should be made to minimize its effects as much as possible. Right? We've probably heard prevention is better than cure. Well, this maxim is representing that exact proverb. What are the medical applications for this? Well, first of all, it gives legitimacy to preventative medicine in general, right? So take your exercise, eat healthy, go out in the sun, don't eat too much junk food, right? So all of these things would be part of the broader fiqh aspect of things. Similarly, immunization, which means that you can basically take vaccines for the different diseases. So you can have vaccination against malaria, smallpox, meningitis, COVID, and any other infectious disease or life-threatening disease that may be. One may ask the question, what about vaccines? You know, there are a lot of people who are very much against vaccinations as well. So it would be allowed to take vaccination if the doctors say, but would it be false to take vaccinations? That's a whole different question that we might discuss later. It also, a preventative medicine would also allow then for quarantine to take place. So imposing a quarantine on a person with a contagious disease until their disease is actually finishes, that would also be permissible. And not only that, it's kind of like sanctioned by the hadith as well. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions that the plague was a punishment that was inflicted on those before you or on the children of Israel. So when it has broken out in a land, do not depart from that land, neither enter it. So this hadith also gives legitimacy to the concept of quarantine within Islam. Another example of the use of this maxim is that if a person, if they make wuzu, they fear that their disease is going to increase or it's going to take a longer time to heal, they're allowed to do tayammum instead of using water. Um, Ignorant physicians or those who lack proficiency can also be barred from practice because of this maxim. Similarly, medical waste should be disposed of properly and away from populated areas because it could be harmful. And also, the use of anesthesia during a surgery, right, to reduce the sensation of pain, because pain in severe cases, I, it's a lot. It can also result in death. So, in order to avoid such cases and in order to avoid extra pain, it would be allowed to use anesthesia بقدر الحاجة, of course. And also, if normal birth is difficult to perform, normal childbirth, it's becoming difficult on the mother, then using the cesarean section, a C-section, in order to save the newborn and the mother would also be permissible. The third maxim, الضرر لا يزال بمثله, that harm may not be eliminated by an equivalent harm, right? This qaida is basically like, or this maxim is basically, you could say an explanation and a condition for the first maxim, أي الضرر يزال, that harm must be removed. But harm must be removed was very open. It could have been, you can remove that harm with something that has no harm, equal harm, more harm, right? So it was very open. This maxim actually explains more of what that qaida actually meant, right? And so this indicates that the removal of prevention of harm should not result in a harm which is similar in nature or worse, because frankly, that is just that would be a very stupid thing to do. So harm should be removed with the optimal condition without bringing any harm in its place. And if that's not possible, then the net effect should be a reduction of the current harm that is being caused. What are the medical applications for this? What can we understand? Well, for example, it would not be permissible for a physician to prescribe a medicine that is likely to cause symptoms the same as that of the initial disease, or maybe even worsen the condition of the person. Similarly, it's not permissible to withdraw devices or equipment from a patient who has an ongoing need of them in order to use them for another patient. Because to use them for another patient would be to harm that first patient. Except in the case like if the first patient, they no longer have a chance of survival, and maybe the second patient does, then obviously in that case it will be different to shift the device. For example, most people in coma would probably never wake up. So a person using a ventilator, but they're in a coma and they've been there like for 10 years or whatever. Uh, and then you have this patient who's new, he just got into an accident, he needs that ventilator. It is better to shift it if there's just one, because the chances of survival of the second may be higher than that of the first. Usually not always the case, so that could be an exception to the general rule over here. Donating an organ from your own body, which might actually severely harm you, is also not permissible. So you have a heart, you can't give your own heart in order to save someone else whilst you're still alive, or giving your own lungs, or maybe both your kidneys. So such kind of organ transplants would be impermissible, on the opinion of those who believe that it is legitimate to actually donate your organs while you are living. Surgeries are prohibited, those surgeries that have a high chance of failure, right? Or the result may be death or a damage to the patient's limb or loss of senses. That's very important to know because a lot of times a doctor might suggest, a high risk, high gain game. If you might have this surgery and your disease would be gone, or you might die on the operating table, right? I don't know if you've ever seen a medical show like New Amsterdam, Grey's Anatomy. You'd probably find episodes where this is the kind of situation that plays out. Allah alam. It is also allowed for a person to donate blood to help another person if it's going to result in then him needing a blood transfusion. And so you can probably understand by these few examples how this qaida is being applied in case in order of the first one. Next, you have qaida number 4, الضرر الأشد يزال بالضرر الأخف. It's kind of like a variant of the previous qaida. You could probably say it's not a qaida in its own, just the same thing being discussed in a different way. So when a person faces two harms, then they should act according to the option which brings about the lesser harm, right? This is only in the case when you can't actually uh, evade both of the harms completely. So it is logical to adopt that which would cause you lesser harm. And there are other maxims which are very similar to this one. For example, the maximum of the choice of the lesser of two evils, or when there's a conflict between two detriments, two harmful things, then the greater harm must be avoided, even if that means accepting and adopting lesser harm, right? So, like I mentioned, they all have the same meanings in different ways. They are being described. What are the medical applications for this qaida? Well, if there is no medical treatment except for surgery, right? Then obviously surgery involves some harm, right? It involves being cut up, the possibility of an infection, and then the pain that it's going to cause, the stitches, and the taking care of it afterwards. A lot of problems. But if a person is in a condition where surgery is the only option to get rid of their disease, then uh, the pain of surgery or the harm of surgery is going to be taken in, or I mean, it's not going to be considered, and a person can go through that surgery. If becoming pregnant can result in a major harm for a woman, then taking contraceptive drugs would be permissible for her. Again, if normal birth is extremely difficult or harmful for the mother or the child, then cutting or making an incision through the mother's abdomen, i.e., the C-section, uh, is also permissible. Right? I mean, it's better to save the child than for it to die in the mother's womb, because the zarar of that is much more than the zarar of the surgery. Skin grafting would be permissible for the treatment of burns and the complications that arise from burning. Um, you can either use a person's own skin or use artificial skin for that matter, or maybe from another animal, because the damages that arise from leaving that burnt part exposed are more than the damages that arise from performing the surgery, right? And so the person should use that. Fifth qaida is درء المفاسد مقدم على جلب المصالح. That avoiding of detriment tasks takes precedence over bringing about benefit. What it means is that if a certain action has both a positive effect and both a negative effect, right? Or you could say that doing something might result in a benefit and a loss, then our first priority should be to avoid the loss, even if it means we're not getting that certain benefit. So whenever there's a choice between something that is detrimental and something that benefits, warding off the detriment would take priority, provided that the detriment is of greater nature of or of equal nature to the benefit that you will be gaining, right? But if there is harm, but it's nothing compared to the benefit that you would get out of the action, then in that case, go for the benefit. Else, in that case, someone might use this maxim and say that I'm no longer going to work because it's harmful, it is stressful, it puts stress on my body, on my mind, and so it's better not to earn at all. But obviously, the benefits of working are much more than that of staying idle. Now, what are the medical applications for this? Well, first of all, except for extreme circumstances, it is impermissible for a woman to be alone with a male physician, uh, and vice versa. So obviously, if there's a doctor, a male physician or female physician, and your patient is of the other gender, there is a maslaha there, obviously, because being a doctor, they are going to treat you and heal you. But at the same time, being alone with them, there's also a mafsada which might be much greater than the benefit that could come out of this engagement, right? And so keeping the hadith in mind, لا يخلون رجل بامرأة إلا ومعه ذو محرم, that a man should not be alone with a woman without her mahram. Uh, you know, going against this hadith and all of the things that entail with it. Second of all, it is not permissible to use Islamically prohibited substances for medication because although being a medicine, it benefits, the disadvantages of that outweigh the benefits. Again, except for in conditions, extreme conditions where you don't have any other alternatives. Um, it is legitimate to prevent an incompetent physician from practicing medicine because even though there is a maslaha, right? That is a means of income for that doctor, for example. But the mafsad of that, the harm that is being caused to the patients, is much more than that particular maslaha that is happening. And so you can bar a incompetent physician from actually practicing. Artificial insemination can also be permitted in cases of need, with the condition that the semen, ovum, and the uterus all come from a legally married couple, of course. Right? And so this is a benefit, but at the same time, using artificial insemination results in a mafsada, which is exposing your aura, because the doctors that those who are going to extract the ovum or place them in the uterus obviously will have to look at that person's aura. But if they're not able to conceive normally, uh, stimulating birth, stimulating population growth is a maslaha which outweighs the mafsada of exposing the aura. So in such cases, exposing the aura would be permissible. And also, because zarar must be avoided, even if there is a maslaha, surgeries that are unlikely to succeed or have a high risk of failure are not permissible. Another example they also mention is the impermissibility of removing the testicles from one person and transplanting them to the other, because there are a lot of cons of doing such a surgery. Um, and any benefit that you can imagine from it is much less than the damages that this could do. Though, frankly speaking, I'm not sure I really understand this example myself completely. Allahu alam bisawab. Sixth maxim is a maximum most of us are very familiar with. الضرورات تبيح المحظورات. I necessity renders prohibited things permissible, right? So, in the event of a danger which likely threatens a person's religion, life, mind, lineage, or property, it becomes permissible for the person to do what would normally be forbidden. So, a zarura, a necessity, is derived from the word azar, a harm, right? And what this means is that a state of danger or hardship that threatens the person so much that they fear the damage or loss of life, mind, honor, or property. In such cases, it would be permissible to do things which are normally prohibited, such as committing an unlawful act, forsaking a religious duty, or delaying it beyond its time, or whatever the reasons is, as far as that results in repulsion of that evil, which is most certain to occur otherwise. That said, this maxim has some conditions and stipulations that must be kept in mind before we are there to try to apply them. So, first of all, it must be a real danger to a person's life or property of actually being perished or damaged heavily, and not just a khayal or not just an imaginative danger. It should be an actual danger. So a person must be close to certain or 100% certain based on their experience that this is going to happen. Second condition is that the necessity must be compelling, right? It should actually affect the five areas of the zarurat or the maqasid of Sharia we talked about. It should actually be threatening to your being, to your life, mind, lineage and progeny, and your wealth, and not just your comfort, right? It being just uncomfortable, not actually damaging, does not allow you to use this maxim to make haram halal. The third condition is that you should not have any other lawful means to repel the threat. Because if you have Islamically lawful means to do that, you're not allowed to use a haram route for such a thing. Fourth condition is that this maximum can only be used بقدر الضرورة, and you can only use it to the point that your need is being met. Any harm is repelled. You can't go beyond that, right? So this maxim, in other words, is restricted by another maxim. A necessity is given consideration, but in due proportion. So, for example, if a person is dying because of hunger, they would only be allowed to eat enough of haram food for them to survive, not to fill their bellies and enjoy it, basically. Eat enough so you can live. And khalas, that is the enough. Or for example, if there's a need to open the aura of another person to perform a medical treatment, you should only open enough of the aura that would be necessary to perform the medical treatment and not just completely expose that person head to toe. So the fourth condition was basically that you can only use this maxim to repel the harm being done by the minimum effort that could possibly be helpful. The fifth condition, or the stipulation, is that the prohibited act in question cannot encroach upon other people's right? So you cannot remove the harm on yourself by harming another person. In some cases, you might be required to pay compensation. For example, if in dire need you had to steal someone's wealth in order to buy food or whatever reason, then you'd have to pay for that. And in cases where your life is in danger and so is their life in danger, you have to just bear the fact that you'd have to die. For example, you can't kill someone just to save your own life, right? So removing harm from yourself does not permit for you to harm other people. Number six is that in the case of consumption of medicine or a treatment, only in the case when a competent and religiously honest doctor prescribes to you a haram medicine when there's no other halal alternative, only then can you go towards the haram medicine. And number seven, the afflicted person must not violate the fundamental principles and precepts of the Sharia, i.e., the core beliefs of the entire thing that is happening. So, if any act tends to violate these fundamentals, the state of necessity will not be given consideration because a person would be compelled by necessity, may only violate peripheral rulings of Sharia, not its fundamentals. This is very important. Anything going against the aqaid is problematic. This exemption from this qaida is mostly in uh, the particulars of fiqh. I gave you some examples when discussing the stipulations for this qaida. Some more examples. For example, if medicines, involve a small modicum of haram, then most ulama are in the opinion that you can actually use them in case halal alternatives are not available. That's number one. Number two, in case you need blood and you don't find anyone that can donate, for you, the person in need, it is permissible to buy blood from someone else, although selling blood in itself is haram. Would be permissible to uncover your aura in front of a doctor, enough of it for him to look at it and perform whatever treatment that needs to be done. Also, it is permissible to use anesthetics knocking yourself out if you're undergoing surgery, which would normally be impossible without it. The last maxim that we have, الضرورة تقدر بقدرها. This is basically, again, the same thing that we mentioned. Uh, it is a condition for the previous qaida, a caveat for it. So even when necessity renders prohibited acts lawful, it's limited, it's not open, right? So the authorization is strictly limited to what repels the necessity. So if doing 1/10 of the prohibited action is sufficient to repel the harm, then only 1/10 is permissible. You can't do more than that. And this is applied in different scenarios as well, right? We already mentioned the examples to you. What also includes under this maxim would be, for example, the use of splints and bandages, right? So you can only use them on parts of the body that will be necessary to cover, and you can't cover more than that. And amputation where medically needed would also be permissible, but only to the amount that the harm should be removed, and you shouldn't be cutting more than that body part. Why? Because even though these things are becoming halal for some reason, they can only be halal for the amount that is safe and necessary. Allahu alam bisawab.